All right, welcome. This will be last lesson on graphing trigonometric functions. Here we've talked about amplitude and we've talked about period. But the midline and the phase shift is something else we're going to learn about. Phase shift we'll be talking about going left or going right. And the midline is calculating the line that cuts a graph in half, okay? So what I'd like you to do is have this in your notes and we'll begin. We'll first talk about what it means to do a phase shift. So what does it mean to shift to the left or shift to the right? So we'll do shift to the right as a first example over here. So have this in your notes before we begin, and then we'll start. So to shift to the right, you want to subtract something when you're in this area. So our phase shift over here is going to be to the right pi over 2. Okay, and what that means we don't know yet, but I'll talk about that very soon. Notice that just because it says negative here, don't think you go to the left, you're actually going to the right. Here, finding the amplitude, well, that's straightforward. This 4 is our amplitude, and then how do we find the period? Well, remember, this represents the A, this represents the B value, and what's the formula for period? It's 2 pi over B. And what's our B value? It's a half. So this is 2 pi divided by 1/2. And that equals what? This equals 2 pi divided by 1/2, which is equal to 2 pi times 2 over 1, which equals 4 pi. And then what do we do with that 4 pi? Remember, we break 4 pi into 4 parts, and then how do you do that? You just take 4 pi, you divide it by 4, and we get pi. And it's like that example I showed you before. Let me get a piece of paper over here, that if I wanted to break, let's say 100, I want to break 100 into 4 parts, well, what do? I just divide 100 divided by 4, I get 25. Well, then I'm just going to do what? This is from 0 to 100, and then I'm going to break it into 4 parts. This is one part is 25, and then how do I get to the next part? This is plus another 25, which is 50, then 75, and 100. And notice I have 4 equal parts. Well, we're just going to do the same thing over here. We just take that 4 pi and we break it into 4 equal parts. So what's our period? It's pi. So notice that originally, what did we have to do? We just take our period. So this is here, right? So we have 0, 4 pi, and now we have pi, 2 pi, and 3 pi. But the thing is, usually what we did before is we took this and we just put it over here in this graph, and we said, okay, no problem. And this would be what 4? This is 4 and negative 4. But now what's happening is there's a phase shift. So we can't just use this interval of 0, pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, and 4 pi. What we're going to do is we're going to take every part of the interval and add pi over 2. Okay? If we're going to add pi over 2 to every one, instead of starting at 0, we're going to start at pi over 2. And then this one is going to be pi plus pi over 2. This one is going to be 2 pi plus pi over 2. This one is going to be 3 pi plus pi over 2. And this is going to be 4 pi plus pi over 2. Okay? And now here, what will this become? Well, this is just here, if this is 0, right? This is going to be pi over 2. Okay, and then what's the next one? What's pi plus pi over 2? Well, pi is equal to 2 pi over 2, right? So this is plus pi over 2. So then this becomes 3 pi over 2. So then this is our next interval here. It's 3 pi over 2. This one will be 2 pi over 2, 2 pi plus pi over 2. This would be 5 pi over 2. This one would be 7 pi over 2. And this one will be 9 pi over 2. Okay? Because here you're just adding a pi over 2. Remember, just to do the algebra, 2 pi is equal to 4 pi over 2 plus pi over 2. So that equals 5 pi over 2. which is this guy over here. And then same thing here, that 3 pi is equal to 6 pi over 2 plus the pi over 2, and this will be 7 pi over 2. Because remember, everything is getting shifted to the right. When we shift to the right, we're going to add a pi over 2 to every single increment. So before, when we graphed our function, when we just had the period, it would just be this. But now we're doing a phase shift. So instead of starting at 0, remember, we don't start at 0. We're going to start at pi over 2. So to complete one cycle, remember, we need a mum-dum. So we're not starting at 0. We're starting here. So this is 0. This is middle, up, middle, down, middle. Okay? It's getting shifted. Okay? All right. Okay, let's see the next example. Here, this is a shift left. And notice that it's different from our previous. When we shifted right, it was negative. When we want to shift to the left, it'll be positive. So then let's graph this function. Let's look at the first part. What I want you to do is take your time, write it down first. And now that you have it down, what's the amplitude? It's 3. What's the period? Well, to calculate period, it's 2 pi over, what's our b value? Our b value is equal to 2. So if it's 2 pi over b, well, that's equal to 2 pi divided by 2, which equals pi. And notice that what are we going to do with pi? We're going to take pi. If we have 0, right, and we're going to have pi, we got to break pi into 4 parts. And if you remember from the previous lesson, that this should be pi over 4, this should be pi over 2, this should be 3 pi over 4, okay? And now what are we going to do with each function? What's our period is pi, but what's the phase shift? It's plus pi over 4. So what are we going to do? We're going to minus pi over 4, so subtract pi over 4 to each part of the interval. Okay, so what are we going to do with the 0? It's going to be 0 minus pi over 4. What about the next one? This pi over 4 minus pi over 4. Then this pi over 2 minus pi over 4. This 3 pi over 4 minus pi over 4. And this pi minus pi over 4. Okay, because you're shifting it to the left, pi over 4 for each unit. So if this was originally 0, what is 0 minus pi over 4? Well, it's here. So this is negative pi over 4. This will be the first part of our interval. What's the next one? What's pi over 4 minus pi over 4? It's 0. So let's just have this over here. This is negative pi over 4. This is 0. What's pi over 2 minus pi over 4? Well, if you just do your algebra, right? What's pi over 2 minus pi over 4? Well, this pi over 2 is equal to 2 pi over 4 minus pi over 4, which equals just pi over 4. So then this is the next part of our interval is over here, is pi over 4. And then what about this one? 3 pi over 4 minus pi over 4, that's just 2 pi over 4, which is just equal to pi over 2. And what's this one? Pi minus pi over 4, that's 3 pi over 4. And then here, this is our interval. And it will be shifted to the left by pi over 4. So what do we need for our cosine? Our cosine needs the mu. So this is starts, oh yeah, we have a 3, right? So this is 3 and this is negative 3. So this is up, middle, down, middle, up. Okay? So this is one cycle of it from here to here. Right? Let's move on. So quick summary, that if we have this a times sine b times x minus c, the a gives you the amplitude, the b helps you find the period, the c will shift it to the left if it's positive. Remember, if it's positive here, it shifts to the left, And if it's negative over here, it shifts to the right. Okay? The next part that we need to talk about is the plus d over here. And I had it in this original example over here, that if we have some plus thing on the side, what it does is, notice how our cosine function, it's not anywhere near 0. What we did was we shifted it up 4, and that's what's happening here. This plus d on the very, very outside, we'll talk about a vertical shift. If this part is positive, it will go up. If this part is negative, it'll go down. Okay? So let's take a look at this example. Here, we're going to put everything together. And if you feel like this is way too fast, just raise your hand and I will help you with this. But let's take a look. Putting it all together. Graph 10 times sine of 1/2 times x minus pi over 2 plus 30. Let's just go through each part. Remember, amplitude is 10, which is this part over here. This 10 represents amplitude. For the period, this 1/2 will help us here. What is the phase shift? The phase shift is to the right, pi over 2. And what's the vertical shift? The vertical shift will be up 30. And what do we want to do? We want to draw one cycle of this. So let's just go one at a time. First, we need the period. And then once we have the period, we do the phase shift. So let's find the period. What is the period? If b is equal to 1/2, right? 2 pi over b is the formula. So we have 2 pi over 1/2, which equals 4 pi. And this is our period. It's 4 pi. But what do we do with the period? We have to break it into 4 parts. So if I have 0 over here and 4 pi over here, if I take 4 pi and I break it into 4 parts, I get pi. What do we do with that pi? We bring it over here, and then we just keep adding by pi. All right? But now, once we have this period, we don't put this here because now there's a phase shift to the right of pi over 2. So when you do the phase shift, what are you doing? You add pi over 2 to to each part of the interval. Right? If it's at 0, we're going to add pi over 2. So what is 0 plus pi over 2? It's just pi over 2. What's the next part? What's pi plus? We did this in which example? Yeah, we did it here for this example. Remember that our period was the same thing. The period was 4 pi. We broke it into pi parts, and we shifted to the right pi over 2. It's going to be the same interval here. It's pi over 2. The next one is 3 pi over 2. The next one is 5 pi over 2. This is 7 pi over 2. And this is 9 pi over 2. Okay, because each one of these is being shifted to the right by pi over 2. So once we graph this over here, that if this is 0, right, we're not going to even touch 0. This is pi over 2. This is 3 pi over 2. This is 5 pi over 2. 7 pi over 2. And 9 pi over 2. So here, what else also has to happen? Remember, we're having a vertical shift of up 30. So if I have a vertical shift of up 30, let's say this is my 30 over here. Right? Remember, the amplitude is 10. And this is the first time that we're really doing this. But remember, if we start at 30, I'm sorry, let's look at one thing over here. Like, if we start at 0, this is the beginning of our m. And when we go up, we're going up 4, which is our amplitude. So here, if we're starting at 30, we need to go up 10. For our sine, we're having a mum-dum. Right? So now this becomes 40. And remember, it's 10 up, 10 down. And so this has to be 20. And now we just draw our function. So this is what we do normally. Here, we have middle, up, middle, down, middle. right? And this is it. Remember, we didn't start at 0 because we had the phase shift to the right. Okay, if we didn't have the phase shift, we always started at 0, but there's a phase shift to take into consideration. And notice that we start at 30, and then this will be up 10, down 10, and then notice what's the midline. The midline, what cuts this in half? It's this over here. This will cut the function in half, and our midline is y equals 30, which is the graph of this line. Okay, let's try and do the next one together. So here, take a second. What I want you to do is try and graph this by yourself. Pause the video, try and graph it. Okay, if we want to see how it's done, what's the amplitude? Okay, amplitude is 5. What's the period? Well, okay, if our b value is equal to 2, then period is equal to 2 pi over 2, and this is equal to pi. What do we do with pi? We break pi into 4 parts. Okay, so if we break pi into 4 parts, this is 0, like pi, we break it into 4 parts, it's just pi over 4. So this is pi over 4. Remember, the cycle ends at pi. This is 2 pi over 4, and this is 3 pi over 4, okay? But what's our phase shift? What is it telling us? That we need to do a left pi over 4. Means subtract pi over 4 to each one of these intervals. So if I have our new interval now, we have to subtract what's 0 minus pi over 4, that's negative pi over 4. What is pi over 4 minus pi over 4, that's 0. Then 2 pi over 4 minus pi over 4 is pi over 4. And this is 2 pi over 4. And this will have to be 3 pi over 4. Because if I take the last one and I subtract it by pi over 4, I get 3 pi over 4. And then this will be our interval. So here, the first part is negative pi over 4. This part is 0. This part is pi over 4. This part is 2 pi over 4, or we could just say pi over 2. Remember, 2 pi over 4 is equal to pi over 2. And this is 3 pi over 4. And then remember, let's take a look about our vertical shift. What's our vertical shift? It's minus 20. So what we have to do is we have to start at minus 20, whatever this is. And what's our amplitude? It's 5. So we need to go up 5, down 5. If we go up 5 from the negative 20, this is negative 15. And if we go down 5, this is negative 25. Okay? And then this is what? Cosine. So we need a the mu, right? So let's start it. Here, these are our 3 sections, right? So when we go up, remember, if this is the middle, right? This will count as middle, this will count as up, and this will count as down. So it's middle, up, middle, down, middle, up. And that is one cycle of cosine, of 5 cosine 2 times x plus pi over 4 minus 20. Is this a lot? Absolutely, it's a lot. Is it difficult? Yeah, it's pretty difficult. All right, you have to take your time and follow the steps step by step, okay? What I like you to do for homework is try and graph these 3. This is a challenge if anyone could graph this one. Best of luck.